Mill demands I vacate my house. Buzz, my husband, aka her son, passed away, so I have no family to live for now, and let her daughter, who's a single mother of 4, move in. Buzz, that's what he would have wanted anyways, so I told Phil about her genius idea at my husband's funeral. Now she's regretting it all. Buzz, they're moving into a smaller house instead. Losing my husband was like losing a part of myself I didn't even know I relied on so much. We had been married for 7 years, built a home together, and shared dreams for a future that now felt shattered. The days following his passing were a blur of condolences, casseroles and endless paperwork. Grief wrapped around me like a thick, suffocating fog, making even the simplest tasks feel like an uphill climb. Amidst all this, my mother-in-law, Elaine, decided it was the perfect time to have a chat. It was the day before the funeral when she cornered me in the kitchen. Her tone was deceptively kind, but I knew Elaine too well. There was always an agenda hiding behind her sugary words. She said she wanted to discuss what was best for the family now that her son was gone. Her words hit me like a tight red slap. My husband had been my entire world, and now she was speaking as if he were some chess piece to move around for our benefit. Elaine explained that her daughter Sarah was struggling to make ends meet as a single mother of 4. Apparently, Sarah's tiny apartment was no place to raise a family, and since I had no children and no family left to live for, it only made sense in Elaine's opinion that I should vacate the house. She actually said those words, "No family to live for." I stared at her, too stunned to even respond. Elaine carried on, oblivious to my shock, as she painted a picture of Sarah and her kids playing in the yard, filling the house with laughter and love. It was, according to Elaine, what my husband would have wanted. Her audacity made my head spin. This house wasn't just any house, it was my home. My husband and I had saved for years to buy it, pouring our hearts into every detail. He had never once mentioned giving it up to Sarah or anyone else. I told Elaine as calmly as I could that the house was staying with me. Her expression soured instantly. She accused me of being selfish, of clinging to something that didn't matter anymore. She even suggested that I was disrespecting my husband's memory by not helping his sister. I couldn't take it. My voice trembled as I told her to leave the kitchen and let me grieve in peace. She huffed but left, muttering something under her breath about me not understanding family values. As soon as she was gone, I sat down and tried to collect myself. The nerve of that woman. Later that evening, my father-in-law Charles approached me. He had noticed the tension and asked if everything was all right. I hesitated, not wanting to cause a scene right before the funeral. Charles had always been the calmer, more reasonable of the two, and I didn't want to drag him into Elaine's drama. But his concern felt genuine, and I told him it was nothing. He nodded, his eyebrows furrowed as if he didn't quite believe me, but he didn't press further. That night, as I lay in bed, Elaine's words replayed in my head. The sheer entitlement of her demand was infuriating. She had acted as though my grief, my home, and my life didn't matter. It was all about Sarah and her kids. The next morning I remembered something Elaine had said during our so-called chat. She claimed Sarah's apartment wasn't suitable for her children, but I knew for a fact that Sarah's financial struggles weren't about the size of her apartment, they were about her lack of responsibility. Sarah had always leaned on others to solve her problems. Her 4 kids had 3 different fathers, none of whom were involved. She refused to hold down a steady job, hopping from one gig to another while relying on Elaine and Charles to bail her out, and now Elaine wanted me to join the list of enablers by handing over my house. I couldn't stop thinking about how Elaine had tried to use guilt as a weapon for it. She said that since I didn't have children I wouldn't understand the sacrifices a mother makes for her kids. It was the same condescending tone she had used throughout my marriage, always implying that I wasn't enough because my husband and I did not have any kids. When I told her the house was mine and I wasn't giving it up, she had the audacity to act as though I was the unreasonable one. She said I was being heartless, that I didn't care about Sarah's children's well-being. I wondered if Elaine had even thought about how our son would feel about all this. My husband had been fiercely protective of me, always putting us first. He would have been furious if he knew his mother was trying to push me out of our home. Later that day, as I was going through some of my husband's belongings, Elaine appeared again. This time she didn't bother with pleasantries. She outright demanded to know why I was refusing to help Sarah. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told her that Sarah's problems were not my responsibility and that my husband would have never wanted me to give up our home. I reminded her that this house was as much mine as it was his and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. Elaine's face twisted in anger. She said I was being cruel and ungrateful, that I didn't deserve the family I had married into. Her words cut through me like a sharp sting, but I refused to back down. I told her that if she wanted to help Sarah she could give up her own house instead of trying to uproot me. Elaine stormed out, slamming the door behind her. That evening Charles approached me again, his expression more serious this time. He asked if Elaine had said something to upset me. I hesitated but decided to be honest. I told him everything about Elaine's demand, her insults and her attempts to guilt-trip me. Charles listened quietly, his face growing darker with each word. When I finished, he let out a long sigh and said he would handle it. For the first time since my husband's passing, I felt a small glimmer of relief. At least someone was on my side, but I knew this wasn't the end of it. Elaine wasn't the type to let things go, and I had a feeling that her next move would be even more outrageous. The day of the funeral arrived. I felt heavy with grief and the weight of everything Elaine had already put me through. We had delayed the funeral a little so that all of our family could arrive. I was determined to focus on honoring my husband's memory and being there for the people who loved him, but Elaine had other plans. From the moment she arrived dressed in all black but with an air of self-importance, she made it clear she wanted attention. She flitted around the room greeting guests with exaggerated sorrow. Her voice carried loudly over the quiet murmurs of condolences as though she was the only one grieving in the house. It wasn't long before I overheard her dropping hints about her plans to anyone who would listen. She was telling people how Sarah and her children needed a stable home and how it was up to the family to take care of each other. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but then I caught her speaking directly to one of my husband's cousins. Elaine told her that I wasn't handling things well and that I was too lost in my grief to see reason. She said it was a shame that I wasn't willing to step aside and do what her son would have wanted, adding that Sarah and her kids were already looking forward to a fresh start. I froze in place, my heart pounding with anger. She was not only planning to steal my home but also painting me as the villain in my husband's death. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. This wasn't just about me, it was about protecting my husband's memory from her selfish manipulation. I needed an ally, and there was only one person who could put Elaine in her place: Charles. I found him standing quietly near the back of the room, greeting a few guests with his usual calm demeanor. Pulling him aside, I told him we needed to talk privately. Charles looked at me, concerned but patient, and led me to a quieter corner. I didn't mince my words. I told him she had been tainting my husband's memory by using his daughter Sarah and her children as leverage, and now she was discussing her intentions with the guests too. Charles' face darkened as I spoke. I could see the tension building in his jaw, his lips pressed into a thin line. When I finished, he shook his head slowly, his voice low and deliberate. He asked if Elaine had truly said all of this. I told him I wouldn't lie about something so serious, especially on a day like this. He didn't say another word to me but turned and walked straight towards Elaine, who was talking to a few guests. I followed at a distance, unsure of what would happen next. When Charles reached Elaine, his voice was firm and loud enough for others to hear. He asked if it was true that she had been pressuring me to leave the house and if she had been spreading her plans to other people during the funeral. Elaine's face went pale and she stammered something about misunderstandings and just trying to do what's best for the family, but Charles wasn't having it. He told her that this was not the time or place for such behavior and that her actions were not only inappropriate but deeply disrespectful to his son's memory. The confrontation drew the attention of several guests and the room fell silent as everyone turned to watch. Elaine's voice grew shrill as she tried to defend herself, claiming that I had been selfish and uncooperative and that she was just thinking of her children. Charles cut her off, his voice rising just enough to silence her. He told her that her entitlement had gone too far and that she had crossed the line by trying to manipulate a grieving widow. He said that this behavior was shameful and that he wouldn't stand for it any longer. The guests around them murmured in agreement, and I could see sympathy in their eyes as they looked at me. Elaine, on the other hand, looked furious and humiliated. She muttered something under her breath and stormed out of the room, leaving Charles to shake his head in frustration. Update 1. After the confrontation, the atmosphere at the funeral shifted. Guests who had overheard the argument began offering their support to me, expressing their disgust at Elaine's behavior. Even some of her family members approached me to apologize on her behalf, saying they couldn't believe how far she had gone. I appreciated their kind words, but I couldn't shake the tension in the air. Elaine might have been publicly humiliated, but I knew she wasn't the type who would back down easily. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the house was quiet again, Charles approached me. He looked tired. The weight of the day was clearly visible on his face. He apologized for Elaine's actions, saying he hadn't realized just how far she had gone. He told me that he was ashamed of her behavior and that he would do everything in his power to make things right. He reassured me that I didn't need to worry about losing my home and that he would handle Elaine personally. His words were comforting, but I was still feeling quite wary. Elaine wasn't someone who could be reasoned with easily. True to her nature, she didn't stay quiet for long. The next morning, I received a text from her accusing me of turning Charles against her and humiliating her in front of the entire family. She claimed that I had blown things out of proportion and that I was the one being selfish. I didn't respond. There was no point in engaging with her when she was in this state. Instead, I focused on taking small steps towards finding some sense of normalcy again. Over the next few days, word of Elaine's antics spread throughout the family. People called to check on me, offering support and sharing their own frustrations with Elaine's behavior. It became clear that this wasn't the first time for her. But this time she had gone overboard. As for Sarah and her children, their plans to move into my home quickly fell apart. Without Elaine pushing the agenda, there was no way Sarah could justify trying to take over my house, from what I heard. Sarah was furious with her mother for ruining everything. But I didn't let it bother me. What mattered most was that I had stood my ground and protected the home my husband and I had built together. Elaine's schemes had failed, and while I knew there would likely be more drama to come, I felt stronger knowing that I wasn't alone in this fight. Charles, true to his word, began making changes in their household to ensure Elaine wouldn't pull something like this again. I didn't know exactly what those changes would entail, but I knew he was serious about holding her accountable. Update 2. The days following the funeral were a blur of exhaustion, resentment, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. I had spent years building a life with my husband, creating a home that I thought was ours alone. I never imagined I would find myself sitting in it alone now with his mother barging in trying to tear it all apart so easily. The audacity of it, the cruelty, and yet I still couldn't quite comprehend it all. I kept waiting for it to feel real, but it didn't. It still didn't feel real. I remember one night a couple of days after the funeral when everything hit me. The grief, the anger, the betrayal. It all crashed down like a weight on my chest, and for the first time I allowed myself to feel it fully. I hadn't cried. The days had been consumed with keeping everything together, dealing with the logistics, the endless visitors, and then mother-in-law schemes. I had kept my walls up, but that night, sitting on the couch, I collapsed. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of grief, guilt, and exhaustion. There were no more distractions, no more tasks to do, no more people around to please. Just me, alone with the mess of emotions I'd been avoiding. I couldn't stop the tears. It wasn't just for him anymore. It was for everything I had lost. For the life we never got to live. For the future we'd never get to share. It was for the dreams I had given up. For the parts of me I had buried so deep in the effort to keep things going, to keep everyone happy. But it was more than just grief. It was the realization that despite all I'd given, all I had sacrificed for our family, it still wasn't enough. It never would be enough. Not for my mother-in-law, not for anyone. I had worked so hard to make everything perfect, to keep the peace, to maintain some sense of family unity, and it still wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. I had lost my husband, and now I was being forced to lose everything I had left. My home, my place, my dignity. I could hear mother-in-law's voice in my head telling me that I had no family now, no place to go, no reason to stay. Her words echoed over and over, cutting deeper with each repetition. I kept hearing them, wondering if maybe there was some truth to what she said. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I had let myself get too attached. Maybe I should have known from the start that I was never going to truly belong in that family. I had married her son, but maybe I was always just an outsider. I was shaking. The tears wouldn't stop. I remember choking out to myself, "Why does this hurt so much? Why does it feel like it's all falling apart?" And then in the middle of it, I suddenly felt ashamed. Ashamed for letting myself feel so broken, for being so weak. I should have been stronger. I should have been able to handle it. I should have been the one to keep everything together, to keep the peace, to make sure no one else felt hurt, but instead I was just crumbling. I was alone. I felt so alone. And I remember in that moment something finally broke inside me. It was like I had been holding myself together with tiny threads for so long, and now they had snapped. There was no more pretending, no more putting on a brave face. I didn't have to be strong for anyone anymore. I could just feel the weight of everything, every second of every year that had led to this moment. I collapsed to the floor sobbing uncontrollably, and I realized then that this wasn't just about the house. This was about the life I had lost. This was about the dreams that were never going to happen, the future that would never be. It was about me grieving not just my husband, but everything that came with him. His love, his warmth, his laughter. It was about the betrayal not just from mother-in-law, but from life itself. And I had no idea what to do next. I didn't know how to move forward from this. I didn't know how to heal, but one thing was clear at that moment: I had to. I couldn't stay here, stuck in the pain, held back by her. I had to find a way to move on. I had to survive this. I had to honor my husband's memory in a way that didn't let her win. But first I had to let myself feel it all. I couldn't keep pretending I was fine. I couldn't keep pushing it all down. I wasn't fine. I was broken, but that was okay. I just had to take it one step at a time. Update 3. Yes, I'm feeling better now. I can't thank you all enough for your support. It means the world to me in my situation. Well, after the fallout at the funeral, Elaine tried to regain some semblance of control. It didn't take long before she started reaching out to the extended family, spinning her version of the story. She claimed that I had exaggerated everything and that Charles had been too harsh on her post the funeral scene. She painted herself as a misunderstood matriarch, only trying to do what was best for everyone. At first, a few family members seemed to entertain her. They were curious about her sudden outburst and wondered if perhaps there was more to the story. But as more details emerged, especially from people who had overheard the confrontation at the funeral, Elaine's narrative quickly toppled down. She tried to argue that Sarah's situation as a single mother of 4 made her the most deserving of the house. She emphasized that family should support family and that I had no children or immediate relatives who needed the space. According to her, I was selfish for holding on to a home that could better serve Sarah's needs. What she didn't account for was the support I had quietly garnered in the days following the funeral. Charles, my biggest ally, wasn't shy about correcting Elaine's fabrications. When her justifications reached his ears, he responded with a firm public denouncement. Charles told anyone who would listen that Elaine's actions had been motivated by entitlement, not family loyalty. He reminded them that his son, my husband, had worked hard to secure our home together and that his wishes had never included uprooting me for someone else's convenience. Charles's blunt honesty left little room for Elaine to spin her web of half-truths. Still, Elaine didn't give up easily. She confronted Charles in their home, pleading her case in a desperate attempt to salvage her plans. She insisted that I was manipulating him, that I was using grief as a shield to deflect from her reasonable suggestions. Charles didn't raise his voice, but his words were sharper than ever. He told her that she had embarrassed herself and their family. He said that he wouldn't allow her to destroy his relationship with his daughter-in-law, especially not with underhanded schemes that dishonored their son's memory. The final blow came when Charles made an unexpected announcement later that week. He had decided to downsize their house and move into a smaller apartment with Elaine. Their large home, which had been the center of so many family gatherings, was going up for sale. Charles framed it as a practical decision, citing the cost of maintaining a large property now that it was just the two of them. But everyone knew the truth. By moving, he was effectively cutting off Elaine's ability to orchestrate power plays like the one she had attempted with me. The announcement sent shockwaves through the family. Elaine was blindsided. She was in shock and disbelief. For once, she had no rebuttal. Her protests about how much she loved their home and how unfair the decision was fell on deaf ears. The shift in dynamic was clear. Charles was taking charge and Elaine was losing her grip on the family narrative she had controlled for so long. Update 4. As the dust settled, Elaine began to realize just how much damage she had done to her reputation. Word of her behavior had spread beyond the family now. Everyone started looking at her differently. People whispered about how she had tried to oust her grieving daughter-in-law from her home. Some openly questioned her character, wondering how a mother could stoop so low after the loss of her own son. She tried to pivot, focusing on Sarah and her children as a way to rebuild her image. She began organizing small family events at their new apartment, hoping to garner sympathy for Sarah's struggles. But the family's patience with Elaine had worn thin. Few attended and those who did weren't shy about expressing their disappointment in her actions. Meanwhile, I was overwhelmed by the support I received from the same extended family and community. People I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to offer kind words. They shared their own stories about dealing with entitled relatives. They commended me for standing my ground and for handling the situation with grace, even when Elaine had tried to paint me as the villain. Sarah, for her part, seemed to resent me for standing in the way of her opportunity. She avoided direct contact with me, but I heard that she was struggling to adjust to life without the windfall she had been promised. Despite the chaos, I began to feel a sense of closure. Charles's decision to sell their house and move into an apartment felt symbolic. It was a tangible shift, a sign that the family was no longer willing to accommodate Elaine's toxicity. For Elaine, the smaller apartment was a constant reminder of her miscalculation. She had expected to gain more control over the family by pressuring me, but instead she had lost her standing in her home. As for me, I focused on moving forward. My home, once the center of her schemes, became a sanctuary again. I filled it with memories of my husband, reminders of the life we had built together. Charles's quiet support remained a steady presence and for that I was grateful. He had chosen to honor his son's memory by standing up for what was right even when it meant upending his own life. The journey wasn't over but I felt at peace. Elaine's regrets were her own to bear and I had no intention of letting her bitterness overshadow the life I was rebuilding. Update 5. My evening was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was my father-in-law standing there in his worn coat looking both weary and resolute. His face, usually guarded and quiet, now carried a weight that spoke volumes. He asked if he could come in, his voice gentle but carrying an air of urgency. I couldn't help but notice the tiredness in his eyes. It had been building for days, a heaviness that seemed to drag him down with every passing hour. After everything that had happened, I had expected him to retreat into his own space, to perhaps seek solace in the silence of their home. But instead, here he was standing in front of me as if the weight of everything had finally forced him to speak. He exhaled deeply, staring at the floor for a long moment before finally speaking. He said he had had enough. There was an intensity in his words that caught me off guard. The calmness he had always displayed seemed to be masking something more profound beneath the surface. He was tired of it. Tired of her. Tired of everything. He had let her manipulate him for years and he admitted his ignorance towards her ways. But now, after everything that had happened, after losing his son, he couldn't stay silent anymore. Father-in-law looked up at me, his eyes locking with mine as if searching for understanding. He said that he was done with her, that he couldn't look at her anymore. She hadn't mourned her son. She hadn't given him the space to mourn. Instead, she was too busy pushing her own agenda. Father-in-law said he just couldn't stay quiet any longer, not when it was all falling apart. My heart skipped a beat as the weight of his words hit me. Charles wasn't just tired, he was broken too. He had watched his wife's cruelty unfold for years and now he had reached his breaking point. He told me he was ready to make a change. He continued saying that he couldn't keep living like this, keeping his silence just for the sake of peace, not when she was so selfish. And then, in a quiet yet firm voice, he said he was ready to move out. He had already made his decision. He had thought about it for days and now he was ready to act. Since mother-in-law wanted to help their stupid daughter so much, she could have her move into the small apartment they had been living in and Charles would have to move out. The idea felt surreal, but at the same time it was a relief. For once someone was standing up against her. Someone was making a choice that wasn't dictated by guilt or manipulation. I was happy that he wasn't going to play by her rules anymore. Father-in-law paused looking over at me, his eyes pleading for some sort of recognition like he needed me to understand that he wasn't just abandoning her. He was finally standing up for what was right, for what she deserved. He told me he had already confronted mother-in-law. He had told her that she was soulless, that she wasn't even mourning the loss of her own son and yet she had the audacity to demand the house from me. Father-in-law said he had told her how disgusted he was by her behavior, how he couldn't stay silent anymore. I could hear the rawness in his voice as he recounted the confrontation. He said mother-in-law had screamed at him, accusing him of abandoning her, of siding with me over his own flesh and blood. But father-in-law wasn't backing down, not anymore. It was then that I realized how much father-in-law had changed in such a short time. This wasn't the man who had silently endured mother-in-law's behavior for years. This was a man who had finally found his voice, a man who had recognized the toxicity around him and was no longer willing to accept it. Charles stood up slowly, his eyes still focused on me, his presence heavy with the weight of his words. He said he was sorry for what she had put me through. He said that he would do whatever he could to make things right, that he wouldn't let her destroy everything they had left. I felt a lump form in my throat, a mix of gratitude and emotion. He had finally taken a stand, not just for himself, but for me too. Father-in-law looked down for a moment like he was gathering himself before he spoke again. He said he didn't know if this would fix everything, but it was the only thing left he could do. He had to act. I nodded slowly, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. I hadn't expected Charles to come to this decision, but now that he had, I couldn't deny how much it meant. The silence between us felt heavy but reassuring. Father-in-law turned to leave, but not before looking back one last time. He said that if I ever needed anything at all, he would be there. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.